Hey guys, tonight we're stepping behind the stone walls of a city you've heard of, but not like this, not in the way where senators speak and armies march in polished sandals. No, this is the other side, the side where hunger settles into your bones like cold water, where hope is a rumor whispered through cracked lips. We're in ancient Rome, but not the Rome of triumphs and feasts. This is the Rome of shadows, of silence, of starvation. Before we get started, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, only if you're really enjoying the content I share here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. So get cozy, let your eyelids grow heavy, and slip with me into a story you've never heard about someone history never named. A girl, a slave, a life lived at the edge of empire and the bottom of the bread line. Her name was Livia, or so she had been told. It wasn't the name her mother gave her. That one was scraped away when she was sold. Years ago, somewhere beyond the Appian Road. Livia was a house slave in a domus near the Aventine Hill, a grand home with high walls that kept out dust, thieves, and for a long while, the truth. The city had been under siege for weeks. Food trickled in only for the rich. For everyone else, trickles turned to drips, then to silence. And in that silence, stomachs turned on themselves. Bread vanished first. Then meat, eggs, olives, even the dry garum sauce that once stank from the kitchens. Now the kitchens were cold. Livia slept on a mat near the fire pit, though there was no fire. The hearth still smelled faintly of smoke, old wood, old ash, a memory of warmth. Her blanket was a faded wool thing that scratched her neck. She didn't care. Lately, nothing felt warm anyway. The night air in Rome was dry, but it carried smells. The Tiber's briny breath, the faint rot of the lower streets, and now something sourer. Desperation had a scent. She'd smelled it once in the slave markets. Sweat, urine, panic. Now it crept back through the alleys. The patrician family she served had begun eating behind closed doors, whispering among themselves. They gave her scraps when they remembered. A few vinegary figs, a rind of cheese, too hard to chew. She still took it gratefully. Hunger was no time for pride. By the third week, she stopped waking from dreams, not because she slept better, but because sleep itself came in brief, fevered drifts, never full. Her ribs pressed against her linen shift like branches under ice. Her legs ached when she crouched, which was always. She was 16, and her bones felt 60. The Domus, once alive with clatter and gossip, had quieted. The other slaves spoke in murmurs, if at all. One had vanished, a kitchen boy named Silas. Some said he'd escaped. Others said he'd been caught stealing barley from the storeroom. Livia didn't ask which was true. Truth was too heavy to carry now. She passed her days grinding acorns into a coarse paste. They were bitter, but edible. Sort of. The old woman in the laundry room claimed the Etruscans used to eat them during lean years. Livia didn't know who the Etruscans were, only that they sounded as hungry as she felt. Once, she tried boiling leather scraps from the discarded sandal straps. It worked. The broth was faintly salty, vaguely revolting, but it warmed her stomach for a night. After that, she boiled water with crushed rosemary twigs and imagined it was soup. Hunger makes poets of the desperate. Outside, Rome's chaos simmered unseen. Riots were rumors, soldiers patrolled the main roads, but even they looked leaner, slower. Livia glimpsed one through the atrium gate. His eyes hollow, lips cracked, tunic too loose. Even the blade on his hip seemed to sag with weariness. The family had begun to barter. Their gold meant less now. Chickpeas were the new currency. Salt had vanished entirely. When Livia saw a rat skitter across the stone path near the garden, She didn't flinch. She simply watched it go, her mouth oddly dry, a thought she dared not name curling behind her eyes. The sun, when it rose, didn't feel golden anymore, just hot. Hot on her skin, hot in her head. She worked in slow motions now, wiping mosaics that no one walked on, watering plants that hadn't borne fruit in weeks. Even the laurel trees seemed tired. That evening, she sat in the laundry corner, folding linens with trembling hands. Her fingers, once quick and silent, now felt thick. Cloth slipped through them, the thread of the world, unspooling. She thought of her mother once, just a flicker, a woman with dark braids, calloused hands, and a voice like riverstone. She used to hum while shelling beans. That memory made Livia's throat tighten. She hadn't heard humming in weeks, only footsteps, whispers, and the endless growl of empty bellies. On the 5th night of the 3rd week, the sky turned a deeper shade of purple than usual. Dust hung in the air. Livia climbed onto the kitchen bench to stare through the narrow window slit toward the forum. She could see plumes of smoke, more than normal. Someone said a bakery had been looted, another said it had been burned to prevent looters. The difference no longer mattered. Her stomach churned as though filled with stones. She sipped water, more slowly now. The cistern was low. The master had warned them, no waste. Even thirst had begun to feel like a luxury. In the evenings, the house creaked more, not from age, but from hunger. It echoed in footsteps, in silence, in dreams. Livia once thought she heard weeping. Then she realized it was herself. She began counting steps between chores, between rooms. 112 from the kitchen to the laundry. 73 from the garden to the servants' quarters. Numbers were easier to hold on to than hope. One morning, she found herself chewing on parchment. An old receipt from the storeroom crumpled in the corner. Her teeth stopped just as she realized what it was. She laughed, then cried, then laughed again. Hunger did strange things to the mind. And so the night deepened. Stars above Rome blinked through smoke haze. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell quiet. And in the shadows of the great stone house, Livia curled up near the hearth, pressing her knees to her chest. Sleep would come. Not with dreams, but with silence. And maybe silence was safer now. Safer than what waited in the streets. Safer than what tomorrow would bring. By the 4th week, the hunger had stopped feeling like a sharp thing. It dulled now, settled into the marrow. It made everything slow, even time. Livia would blink and find an hour had passed, or none at all. Some mornings she wasn't sure she had woken up. The days bled into each other like spilled wine on old marble. The house grew quieter still. Even the birds that once sang near the atrium had vanished, chased away by stillness or drawn to better scraps elsewhere. The mosaic tiles in the hallway had begun to lose their polish, not from neglect, but from the thin layer of dust that seemed to coat everything now. No one swept unless told to, and no one gave orders unless necessary. Livia moved through the villa like a ghost. Her tasks were fewer now, but stranger. One day she was told to sort lentil pebbles from real lentils. There were only 5 lentils in the entire basket. Another day she was sent to search the cracks in the wall for mushrooms. None grew. The air was too dry, too hot, too dead. She learned to chew dried laurel leaves, not for sustenance, but because they gave her mouth something to do. The bitter taste kept her mind anchored. Sometimes she tucked them under her tongue like secrets. At night, the fires were no longer lit. Fuel was too precious, and besides, warmth was not the danger. The chill had been replaced by the weight of nothingness. The hearth, once sacred, now looked like a tomb. Its ashes held stories of meals long gone, cracked eggshells, fish bones, the rind of a melon from last summer. Memory was a cruel indulgence now. She saw her reflection once in a silver plate. It startled her. Hollow cheeks, a nose sharper than she remembered, eyes too large for her narrow face. A stranger had taken residence in her skin. The patrician family still held feasts, in their minds at least. Livia heard them talking about recipes, old dinners, even dream-tasting roasted boar. The children played a game where they named their favorite fruits and tried to outdo each other in sweetness. The eldest once said, "I'd trade my sandals for a fig." Everyone laughed. Livia did not. The slaves shared what little they could. Daphnis, the old man from the atrium, passed Livia a lump of stale barley paste one afternoon. "Chew it slowly," he said, "and pretend it's honey cake." He smiled with cracked lips. Livia nodded, biting a corner as though it were precious stone. She began spending more time in the kitchen courtyard. It was shaded by a half-dead olive tree, the leaves brittle but still greenish at the edges. Sometimes she swept imaginary crumbs from the flagstones. It gave her hands something to do, her mind a rhythm. One afternoon, she found herself boiling stones. There had been an old tale told by a woman in the laundry quarters, how boiling stones could fool children into thinking soup was coming. She tried it herself, chose 3 smooth pebbles from the fountain, scrubbed them clean, and dropped them into the bronze pot. The sound of them hitting metal made her flinch. She added water and stirred with a ladle. Steam rose, carrying no scent. She imagined herbs. She imagined garlic. She imagined that was all. When the others passed by, they smiled faintly, as if grateful for the performance. Livia ladled a bowl of clear water and pretended to sip. Her lips touched the rim but did not drink. That evening, she offered bowls to the others. Daphnis laughed, an old raspy wheeze, and took one. He drank it with closed eyes. "Delicious," he said, "just like me mother made." Another slave, a girl younger than Livia, cried as she held the warm water in her palms. "It's hot," she whispered. "It's hot." Livia sat beside them in the courtyard, their makeshift feast laid out on a cracked tray. There was nothing to eat, but they clinked cups together. "To boiling stones," Daphnis toasted. "To boiling stones," Livia repeated. In the upper house, the mistress had taken to wearing perfume more often. It masked the sourness of the rooms, the damp wool, the scent of unwashed linen. Livia noticed it each time she brought the laundry or collected the trays, spiced myrrh, almond oil, and something sharper beneath. The master, once proud of his girth, now cinched his belt tighter each week. His face looked sunken. His voice, when it rose, came in short, barking syllables, no longer the drawl of a full man, but the clipped sound of controlled slipping. The children grew quieter too. Livia heard them arguing over raisins one morning. There were only 2. Their tutor had stopped coming. "No use learning letters when the city forgets how to count," he had muttered before vanishing. Some said help would come. Others said no one remembered them. Rome was a city that fed on its own legend. But now even legends went hungry. One evening, Livia walked the edge of the garden path. She bent to examine the soil, dry and crumbling like old bread. No herbs, no weeds. Even the pests had abandoned it. She lay down on the warm stone path and stared at the sky until the dusk turned purple, then grey, then nearly black. A soft drizzle began, rare in midsummer. She opened her mouth to catch droplets, savouring each one as if it were wine. When it stopped, she felt richer than any senator. Inside, the silence of the villa deepened. You could hear skin brushing linen. You could hear bones crack when someone stretched. Even the rats tread lightly now. In the laundry room, someone found an old sack of lentil husks, inedible but fragrant. Livia pressed her face to the cloth and inhaled. For a moment, it was enough. She dreamed that night of firewood piled high, a stew pot bubbling with cabbage and onion, a rough hand brushing hers as bread was torn. In the dream, her name wasn't Livia. She woke with her hand curled around nothing. Her stomach spoke louder than her voice. There was a morning, not long after the boiling stones, when the master called Livia by name. He never did that. Normally it was girl, or you there, or silence. But this morning his voice came rasping down the corridor. Livia. It stopped her mid-step. She turned slowly, like someone responding to an echo. He stood at the far end of the hallway, dressed in robes too loose, hair uncombed. The rings on his fingers clinked dully as he gestured her forward. The atrium was still dim with early light. Dust danced in the shafts that fell through the skylight, and the pool at the center, once filled with clear water, now held only shadows and flies. He pointed toward the storeroom. "Bring me what's left." Livia bowed her head and obeyed. She had already memorized every corner of that storeroom. Clay jars, once fat with olives, now held only pits. The grain bins were almost hollow, and the few remaining pulses were mold-dusted and shriveled. She gathered what she could into a basket: 3 onions, 1/2 pint of spoiled garum, 2 cracked eggs, and a heel of bread so stale it clicked when set down. She brought it to him in silence. He looked over the collection with glassy eyes, then dismissed her with a flick. But as she turned to go, he muttered, "Thank you." Softly, almost to himself. She did not stop, did not reply, but that moment stuck like a pebble in her sandal all day. In the lower quarters, things were more direct. Daphnis no longer rose from his mat unless summoned. The others helped him gently. He was old, but he was also losing something else. Not just strength, but lightness. Livia once heard him whispering to no one, calling for a brother long dead. The snail was chewy, salty, and gone in 2 bites. It was the best thing she'd tasted in a week. That night, thunder rumbled faintly over the city. Cassia, the laundry girl, began saving the rinse water to soak bitter greens she found by the garden wall. It didn't help much, but it softened the chewing. She was the youngest among them, barely 12. Her eyes were wide, always watching. One day, Cassia tugged at Livia's sleeve and handed her something wrapped in cloth. It was a cooked snail. "I found 5. I boiled them. You can have this one." Livia took it slowly, feeling the warmth against her palm. She didn't ask where the other 4 went. The snail was chewy, salty, and gone in 2 bites. It was the best thing she'd tasted in a week. That night, thunder rumbled faintly over the city. Not a storm, just a warning, the kind of thunder that makes no promise of rain. The wind carried the smell of distant smoke, and Livia wondered how many hearths were still burning in the homes around them. Probably few. She lay awake beside the cold hearth again, listening to the crackle of wood memory. Her body had become so thin that her own heartbeat felt loud. Each thump pulsed through her back, her chest, her ears. She curled into herself as if shrinking could stop the ache. Sometimes she thought of running, not escape exactly. She had nowhere to go, just motion, just distance. But the gates were watched, and her legs no longer carried speed. The last time she tried running, she nearly fainted. So she stayed. Saturday moved slowly, breathed less just to save effort. The next day brought a discovery. While gathering linens near the atrium basin, Livia spotted something strange in the corner, a mouse, motionless. It had died quietly, tucked behind a jar. She stared at it for a long time. It was whole, not decayed. thin like her, barely there. She wrapped it in cloth and carried it to the courtyard. Daphnis saw and blinked slowly. "Are we that far now?" he asked. Livia didn't answer. Instead, she placed the bundle into a pot with water and rosemary stems. She added a pinch of salt, stolen days ago from a forgotten alcove, and stirred slowly. They drank it in silence. No one chewed, no one spoke. It was warm, and warm was enough. Cassia looked into her bowl and whispered, "He would have eaten us too if it were the other way around." Daphnis chuckled. "Then it's a fair trade." Above them, the patrician children had stopped playing games. Their laughter no longer echoed through the tiled halls. One had fallen ill, though no one said it aloud. The mistress moved about with darker circles under her eyes, more perfume on her skin. She no longer scolded, not even when Livia forgot to bow. Once, Livia caught her standing by the kitchen, staring at a wall. She was holding a spoon, not using it, just holding it, as if memory alone could fill her. In that moment, something in her looked not noble, not proud, but tired, just tired. Later that week, Livia noticed someone had hung a sprig of laurel above the main door, a symbol, protection perhaps, or hope, or simply habit. She stood beneath it for a long time that evening, letting the wind from the cracked tiles whisper through her shift. And then she did something she hadn't done in days. She hummed, not a tune she remembered, not quite, just notes. A soft ripple of sound, low and without shape. Cassia joined in. Then another slave, whose name Livia didn't even know. They sat in the shadows of the garden wall, empty bowls before them, and hummed like ghosts remembering songs. In that brief moment, hunger paused, not vanished, but quieted. And so the dark settled again over Aventine Hill. Another day ended, another bowl emptied, and the quiet war of waiting went on. The days grew hotter, the sun lingered longer now, hanging heavy above Rome's tiled rooftops, its glare bouncing off white stone walls and blinding anyone too foolish to look upward. Shade became currency, cool water legend. And food. Food was myth. Inside the Domus, the air was still and thick. The tall ceilings and open courtyards, once meant to let in breeze, now served only to amplify the quiet. Voices echoed like prayers in an abandoned temple. Livia's duties shifted once again, not by command, but by necessity. There was little left to clean. The floors stayed clean because no one walked. The tables collected no crumbs because no one ate. She began to spend her hours sitting near the rain basin, watching insects hover over the green film on the water's surface. Even they seemed unsure if they should land. One afternoon, while moving empty amphorae in the pantry, Livia found a single olive pit. Smooth, dark, hard as stone. She held it like treasure. Not for eating, it had long since given up its gift, but because it reminded her of salt, oil, flavor. She kept it in her tunic, a totem against forgetting. That night, she showed it to Cassia and Daphnis, who both stared at it as if it glowed. "We should bury it," Daphnis said suddenly, "and pray it grows overnight into a feast." Cassia giggled, more a breath than sound. "We'd guard it like the treasury." Instead, Livia tied it into a strip of cloth and hung it on the laundry hook. It spun slightly in the breeze, a shrine of hunger. Somewhere in the city, dogs barked again, louder this time, persistent. It meant something, maybe a riot, maybe a cart. Rumors drifted into the house like smoke. They said a grain store had been broken into down near the Subura, that men fought each other over lentils, that a baker's child was trampled underfoot. No one knew if it was true. Truth had grown slippery, The master no longer summoned Livia. He remained in his chamber most days, his voice carried by others. His wife paced the upper rooms, muttering to herself about her sister's villa outside the city, about letters never answered. Once, she told Livia to prepare the guest room. "For who?" Livia had asked without thinking. The woman blinked. "I don't know." That evening, thunder rolled again, the kind with no rain, just warning, a dark belly above the city, growling in hunger of its own. Livia stayed by the old olive tree in the courtyard until the sky went nearly black. She liked the sound of the wind rustling its tired branches. It reminded her of the markets before the famine, when stall cloths fluttered and vendors shouted about grapes and honeycomb and salted fish. She imagined holding a loaf of bread again, warm, split open, the smell filling her chest, the way crumbs stuck to her fingers. She smiled faintly, eyes shut. The memory was full enough to chew. Later that night, as they huddled together in the servants' quarters, Cassius spoke. "I think I saw someone trying to climb the garden wall today," she whispered. Daphnis opened one eye. "A thief?" She shook her head. "Too thin, like us." Livia didn't speak. She thought of it too, what lay beyond that wall. Other streets, other courtyards, maybe other girls like her, chewing laurel leaves and praying over stones. But then there was the wall itself. Tall, slick, sharp-edged. Not just built to keep danger out, but to keep people like them in. That same night, the laurel sprig above the door was gone. No one spoke of it. No one saw it fall. But the emptiness above the frame lingered like a mouth suddenly toothless. Livia touched the spot briefly with her fingertips as if to bless it, or mourn it. Inside, the air smelled of vinegar and unwashed skin. Even sleep had changed. Dreams were thinner, stranger. Livia once dreamed she was kneeling in a kitchen filled with figs, but each time she reached for one, it burst into ash. She woke, crying, quietly, into the crook of her elbow. On the 6th week, Cassia's cough began, just soft at first, a dry tickle, but it grew. At night, it echoed through the stone walls like a cracked drum. No one said it aloud, but fear bloomed. Not fear of death, they had lived with that for some time, but fear of what it meant to die now, quietly, unnoticed, without mourning. Livia sat beside her in the mornings, wetting scraps of cloth to press to her forehead. She told her stories, none real, tales of great fish caught in the river, of feasts that lasted days, of gardens that grew peaches in winter. Cassius smiled, sometimes. They all pretended, and still the hunger deepened, like a well with no bottom, drawing breath from every corner of the house. Livia watched a beetle crawl across her foot one evening. She didn't move. It tickled, then it was gone. Just another creature searching for scraps. At dusk, they gathered once more in the courtyard, the three of them. They drank tepid water and chewed stalks of celery root that had gone soft and sour. The taste clung to their teeth. Then Daphnis raised his cup, empty as it was. "To the olive pit," he said. Livia smiled. "To the pit," Cassia managed to whisper. "May it grow fat in our dreams." And under that shrinking Roman sky, in a city of silent fires and quiet dread, Livia felt the smallest warmth. Not in her belly, but somewhere deeper. She was still here. They were still here. And that counted for something. The fire was out again. For 3 days now, no one had lit the hearth, not even for show. The coals had cooled into a bed of grey dust, and Livia no longer pretended to sweep around them. She simply sat beside it in the mornings, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her fingers laced like rope. The air smelled of mildew and old wool. Rain had come, not enough to clean the streets, but enough to make everything damp. The Domus walls were slick in places and laundry hung from the beams like empty skins, refusing to dry. Cassia's cough had softened to a wheeze. It came now with effort. Each breath she took sounded like sand being drawn through a funnel. Daphnis fed her spoonfuls of rainwater mixed with honey scrapings, sugar stolen from a broken jar found behind the apothecary's bench. They called it medicine. It was barely taste. Livia rubbed crushed laurel into warm cloth and laid it on the girl's chest. It smelled sharp and earthy. It didn't heal, but it gave Cassia something to notice besides pain. In the evenings, Livia told stories again, her voice slower, now lower. "There was once a baker," she whispered, "who lived on the edge of the Tiber. His bread was so light, so soft, that even the clouds came down to taste it. But one day, the flour was gone. So he ground stone into powder, mixed it with ash, and baked that instead." Daphnis nodded. "What did the clouds say to that?" Livia smiled faintly. "They said nothing. They ate it anyway." Upstairs, the master's family had begun to change their routines. The younger boy no longer ran. His footsteps now came softly, always followed by a parent's voice, warning, coaxing. The elder girl wept behind closed doors, not for food, but for a pet sparrow that had flown out the window and never returned. Her mother had no energy to comfort her, only murmured that some birds know when to flee. The mistress walked barefoot now. Her shoes made too much noise, she said. Or maybe the sound reminded her of better days. She smelled more strongly of rose oil and bitter herbs, the scent following her like a veil. One evening, Livia saw her slicing dry plums with a knife so clean it gleamed in the lamplight. She sliced them into paper-thin pieces and served them on a single plate, 4 slices for 4 mouths. The children chewed slowly. No one spoke. The master stayed in the study longer these days. His scrolls were scattered, untouched. Once, Livia glimpsed a map on his desk with grains laid atop it, marking roads like tiny soldiers. He burned that map the next morning. In the servants' quarters, conversation dwindled. Every word was weighed, measured, and often discarded. Energy was too precious. Cassia slept most of the day now, curled under linen that had once been tablecloths. Daphnis began pacing again, not far, just back and forth near the atrium pool. The sound of his sandals scuffing the tiles was oddly comforting. Livia resumed watching the insects. Ants, mostly. They still found crumbs somewhere, dragging them toward cracks in the stone, with steady, silent purpose. She wondered if they had a queen, if they mourned their dead, if they ever stopped to rest. A stranger arrived at the villa gate that week. He was wrapped in a dark cloak, face thin and sun-browned. The guards, what few remained, let him pass. Word was sent to the master, and soon a short meeting took place in the atrium, low-voiced, tense. The stranger left with a pouch of something heavy. No one knew what was traded. That night, Daphnis whispered, "We've bartered part of the garden wall for beans." Livia raised an eyebrow. "The wall?" He smiled. "That's what it'll come to. We'll chip the marble and serve it with olive oil." She laughed, softly. Cassia stirred and smiled in her sleep. The olive pit was still hanging near the laundry. It had turned darker, stained by moisture, but it remained. Livia touched it each time she passed, not as ritual, just for its shape, its certainty. It was the only thing in the villa that hadn't changed. One morning, as she was collecting rainwater in a bronze basin, she found 2 tiny mushrooms growing near the outer gutter. They were white and tender. She stared at them for a long time, unsure if they were edible or hallucinogenic or something worse. She brought them to Daphnis, who sniffed them, licked one, then shook his head. "Too brave for me." She boiled them anyway. They added nothing to the water's taste. But she and Cassia and Daphnis drank the broth together, pretending it was stew. For a few minutes afterward, they all sat quietly, half expecting to fall over dead. When they didn't, they laughed, really laughed. It sounded like a miracle. And then the wind changed, from the east this time. It carried the smell of burning straw and something more pungent, cooked meat, distant and faint. The slaves paused. Was it real or imagination? Hunger could do that, summon smells from memory. But the scent stayed. That evening, as Livia sat on the garden wall's edge, she noticed something strange. Movement in the alley beyond. A group of figures, thin and barefoot, walking with purpose. Not rioters, not soldiers, just people, moving. Cassia joined her and leaned weakly against the stones. "Where are they going?" she whispered. Livia didn't know, but in her chest something shifted. Not hope, not yet. Just direction. The villa's heavy gates had not opened in nearly 10 days, but that morning, as Livia rose before first light, she heard them, not fully creaking wide, not swinging in welcome, but moving, breathing, just a crack, just a hinge, clearing its throat. She crept toward the courtyard, bare feet silent on the tiles. Outside, the city was still dim, painted in the watery grey of dawn. The scent of smoke had faded. Now there was only dust, and that other smell, sweat and bread crusts and animal skins, living bodies. She saw them again. People. A procession, loose and quiet, walking not like a mob, but like mourners. Down the far road, barely visible, they trudged in silence. No carts, no beasts of burden, just sandals or none at all. Most carried nothing. Daphnis came to stand beside her. "Refugees," he said. Livia shook her head. "No, not from outside. They're from here." He looked closer, then nodded slowly. Rome is leaving itself. Inside, the air had turned thick with tension. The master paced for the first time in days, issuing short orders to no one in particular. The mistress gathered bolts of cloth into bundles, muttering about the villa in Tibur. Livia caught the phrase twice. The eldest child asked if they would have to leave behind their statues. "They're too heavy," came the answer. Servants moved faster now, suddenly tasked again, not with dusting or cleaning, but with gathering, preparing. Though for what, no one quite knew. Daphnis was called to lift amphorae. Cassia was told to sort linens. Livia, though, was forgotten in the shuffle. She watched them all from the edge of the atrium, a shadow in her own house. In the garden, she knelt by the olive tree. Its bark was cracked, its roots thirsty. She pressed her palm to its base and whispered, "Are you coming too?" The tree said nothing, of course, but something in her stilled. That evening, she found a crust of something in the laundry trough, bitter barley flatbread half moulded. It had been hidden in cloth, forgotten or discarded. She scraped off the mould, toasted it on a warm tile, and split it 3 ways. They ate slowly, even Cassia, managing small bites. It was sour and tough and perfect. Afterward, Cassia spoke for the first time that day. "I dreamed of honey last night," Livia smiled. "Did you eat it?" The girl nodded. "Off a spoon made of gold." Daphnis chuckled. "If you ever find that spoon, bring me a fig." The streets outside grew louder. Horses again, wheels on stone. Something was shifting, not peace, not relief, but motion. The slaves gathered in the atrium that night without speaking. It was instinct. They knew something was ending or beginning or both. Livia found herself looking at the olive pit again, still hanging from its cloth. She took it down gently and wrapped it back into her tunic. It had served its time. The next morning brought visitors, real ones. 2 men in dull bronze armor, not soldiers exactly, but watchmen. They carried long staffs and bore scrolls marked with seals. They spoke to the master briefly, then left without stepping inside. Livia saw their faces, sunburned, lean, eyes scanning constantly. They weren't guarding anything. They were measuring. Daphnis said quietly, "They're counting the living." Livia didn't ask why. Later, while bringing water to the side room, she passed the master's study. The door was open. Inside, she saw him hunched over a letter but not writing, just staring. The lamp beside him flickered with weak oil. He looked up, saw her, and said, "You're the olive girl, aren't you?" She blinked. "Yes," she said softly. He gave a single nod, then looked away. "Good, I remember." She left, puzzled. A name forgotten for weeks, now remembered for a seed. That night, the mistress made her own bed. It was a strange sight, her kneeling over the linens, straightening corners, not for lack of help, but as if needing the motion. Her fingers shook. From across the room, Livia watched quietly. She almost offered help, almost, but she stayed silent. When sleep came, it came gently. Livia dreamed of her old village, not its name, not its face, just a feeling, a memory of water drawn from a clean well, a breeze through reed roof homes, someone humming, not her mother this time, herself. And when she woke, she remembered the tune. The next day dawned with an orange haze. Livia blinked against the strange light filtering through the atrium's open ceiling. It wasn't the soft pink of early morning, nor the golden clarity of a summer sun. This was different, thicker, duller, as though the sun had forgotten how to shine. The smell arrived first, charred wood, burned grain, a sour tang that clung to her skin. Smoke. It wasn't from the Domus. The fire was elsewhere, in some part of the city where the famine had made fire seem like logic. Livia didn't ask. She simply folded her cloth tighter over her face and went about the morning's quiet chores. Cassia hadn't woken yet. Her breathing was shallow, her lips dry. Livia wet a scrap of cloth and placed it on the girl's mouth, letting a single drop slide in. Daphnis said nothing as he sat near the doorway, polishing a cracked bowl with his sleeve. In the upper house, voices rose. The mistress argued with someone unseen, her words sharp, fearful. Then came silence. Livia knew the rhythm by now: panic, pause, retreat. The walls no longer echoed with commands, they swallowed them instead. By midday, the heat had crept into the floor tiles. Livia pressed her hands to the stone and felt it pulse, as if Rome itself had a fever. She moved to the courtyard where the olive tree stood, its leaves drooping, its bark peeling in thin curls. She sat beneath it and pulled out the pit from her tunic. It was warm from her skin. She stared at it, then suddenly stood and dug into the dry soil with her fingers, slow, determined. No tools, no purpose, just movement. The dirt was cracked, stubborn, dry as ash. Still she made a shallow hole and placed the pit inside, covering it gently. "There," she whispered, "now it can be hungry too." That evening a commotion stirred near the gates. Livia rushed to the front corridor, standing just within the shadows. A woman outside shouted, pleading, her voice hoarse. A child cried. Then came banging, then stillness. No one opened the gate. Livia waited until even the cries had faded before stepping out. She found nothing on the stones except a dropped bundle, rags wrapped around a handful of what looked like lentils. She picked it up carefully. Half of them were pebbles. She brought them inside anyway. In the servants' corner, Cassia's eyes fluttered open. She said Livia's name just once. Livia fed her a spoonful of barley water, whispering about the olive tree, about planting, about how, if you listened closely, you could hear it stretch its roots. Cassius smiled weakly. Does it dream? Yes, Livia said, of bees. The master summoned everyone that night, even the slaves. They gathered in the atrium, faces pale, robes loose, sandals frayed. The family stood on one side, the servants on the other. A strange ceremony. No one bowed. The master spoke softly. There is no more to give, not here. We will leave before the gates are sealed. Livia watched him. His eyes were sunken, his hands clenched behind his back. The mistress looked downward, holding her children close. We will go to Tibur, the villa there. I don't know if we'll be let in. I don't know what awaits, but here... He paused, then said it. Here is death. Silence. Then one of the guards asked, and them? He meant the slaves. The master didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away. Later, Livia found herself back in the garden, her hands resting on the disturbed earth where the olive pit lay buried. She didn't cry. There was nothing in her to shed, but she did feel something else, a strange clarity, a looseness in the air. Daphnis came to sit beside her. You could leave too, he said. She looked at him. The streets are open, he added. The crowds have moved east. No one watches the alleys. She didn't answer right away. They might let you stay at the Tibur villa, he said. But they might not. You'd be a mouth. Livia looked toward the wall, toward the garden gate. Beyond that, Rome breathed smoke, but it breathed. That night, she folded Cassia's blanket tighter, placed a warm cloth on her chest, and sat beside Daphnis. They shared the last of the broth. It tasted of nothing, but it filled. Then Livia whispered, Tomorrow? Daphnis nodded once, and the stars above Rome blinked silently, one by one, through a haze of ash and dreaming trees. Morning arrived not with sun, but with fog. A dense, sallow mist blanketed the city, settling low in the courtyards and making the stone paths look like riverbeds. Livia stood alone in the garden, her sandals silent on the damp flagstones. The olive tree loomed behind her, patient, unmoved. The pit she'd buried the day before was hidden beneath the soil now, its resting place marked by a shard of clay tile. She didn't expect it to sprout. That wasn't the point. It was a promise left behind, not to be harvested, but remembered. Inside the house, footsteps hurried. The patrician family was gathering their belongings. Boxes, bundles, children's toys clutched like heirlooms. No horses. There were none left. No carts. They'd already been sold. They would walk or barter their way onto someone else's wagon. Livia watched from the edge of the atrium as they prepared. The mistress carried a folded shawl, hands shaking slightly. Her husband gave quick instructions to a servant who no longer answered. Even the guards looked uncertain, armor tarnished, blades dull. One of them glanced toward the slaves and whispered, "They won't all make it." Livia knew he was right. Cassia could not be moved. Her limbs were too weak, her skin too hot. She lay on her side, murmuring in half-sleep, her small fingers plucking at invisible threads in the air. Daphnis sat by her side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, murmuring stories half-remembered from his youth. Livia crouched beside them, holding a bundle of fabric in her lap. Inside it, she'd packed her only tunic, a strip of dried reed for tying her hair, and a piece of stale barley bread wrapped in fig leaves. A feast by current standards. "She won't last the walk," Daphnis said quietly. Livia nodded. "I will stay with her." She looked at him, his face grey, his beard untrimmed, his eyes calm. He had already decided. "You could go," she said. He smiled gently. "I've walked enough." She touched his hand. Then she turned, slowly, and stepped through the kitchen, past the empty storage jars and the hearth where ash no longer moved. Through the inner corridor, where mosaics showed scenes of banquets and dances, ghosts of another Rome. She reached the back gate. It had been years since she'd touched the latch. Most slaves never opened it. It led not to the street, but to a narrow alley behind the house, a service way. It was used for deliveries once, before the siege. The iron creaked under her fingers. She pressed gently and it moved. The alley beyond was damp and silent. Mist drifted over the stones. She stepped out. The gate clicked shut behind her. For a moment she stood still, letting the chill of the morning mist settle on her skin. It smelled of soot and faintly of rosemary. Then she walked. Her feet found familiar patterns, down past the bakery that hadn't smelled of bread in months, past shuttered homes with signs chalked onto the doors, pleas, warnings, prayers. Mercy! None left. We are gone. She saw no guards, only other figures, some walking like her, others sitting, backs pressed to walls, eyes glazed. Children wrapped in cloaks too large. One man had a chicken on a rope. Livia watched it cluck quietly, as if nothing had changed. She passed a shrine where someone had left flowers. Real ones. Wilted, but unmistakably fresh days ago. A copper coin sat beside them. She didn't take it. At a crossroads near the baths, she paused. The steam houses were cold. Their grand arches looked skeletal now, ribs of a giant beast long dead. A child stood beneath one, mouth open, watching pigeons on the ledge. Livia walked past. By midday, the mist had lifted. Heat returned, dry and sharp. Her legs ached. She stopped in a narrow passage and crouched, unwrapping her fig leaf bundle. The bread was harder than stone. She gnawed at it carefully, letting it soften on her tongue. A shadow moved. She looked up. A woman, older, draped in tattered linen, stood nearby watching her. No words, just eyes. Livia tore the bread in half and held it out. The woman stared for a moment, then accepted it. She sat down beside her, chewing silently. They did not speak. Hunger needed no conversation. Later that afternoon, Livia found herself near the city's edge. She could see the fields beyond the walls, once green, now gold and brown, scorched and empty. A few figures moved through them, tiny against the vastness. A caravan, perhaps, maybe a family, maybe nothing. A ruined cart lay toppled near the gate, 2 wheels gone. Straw scattered like bones. She sat in its shadow and closed her eyes. The wind passed over her skin, hot and dry. It smelled of everything and nothing, ash, olive wood, and somewhere faintly, the ghost of garum. She slept there for a while, her arms tucked beneath her head, the sun warming her back. And in that brief silence, she dreamed, not of food or escape, or even her old village, but of the olive tree. Its roots winding down through stone, its leaves rustling in a wind that smelled like spring, its branches heavy with fruit, and somewhere beneath it, a pit, small and buried, remembering everything. The sun was dipping westward by the time Livia opened her eyes again, the cart's shadow now lengthened and cool across her body. Her neck ached from the stone, but she barely noticed. Her hunger had quieted into a kind of numbness, no longer gnawing, just there, like a stone in her belly. She sat up slowly and looked around. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the sounds of metal clinking, of sandals on dust, of low voices moving in cautious unison. People were returning to the open spaces, not many and not boldly, but with the hesitant rhythm of those too hungry to stay hidden and too tired to hope for safety. She followed them without thinking, moving with their current, blending in. The forum was no longer a place of business or speech. It had transformed into a scattered field of trade, of barter, of watching. No coins changed hands, only goods. A man held out a strip of leather and gestured wildly in search of onions. A child offered a string of wooden beads in return for one date, just one. And off to the side, a pair of women crouched over a cracked pot where something bubbled faintly. Bones, likely, or dried turnips, softened in the last of their water. Livia stood at the edge of it all, heart slow, mouth dry. She had nothing to trade. Her bundle was nearly gone. Even the strip of reed for her hair had been taken by a boy in the alley, snatched like a treasure, and vanished without a word. She moved among the others quietly, her eyes sweeping over the makeshift stalls, planks of wood balanced on crates, broken tiles used as counters. It was a theatre of survival, and everyone played their part with rehearsed silence. Occasionally, someone shouted, but never in anger, only desperation. "I have garlic peel!" one man cried. "Peel!" As if it were gold, no one responded. At one corner, a pile of clothes was being exchanged, not for food, but for warmth. Livia saw a woman remove her outer tunic and hand it to a bearded elder who offered her a small pouch in return. The woman opened it and frowned. It held nothing but salt. She still thanked him. Somewhere near the center, Livia smelled fish, old, sharp, but real. She turned and followed the scent to a man sitting behind a crate filled with small dried sprats. They were stiff, their eyes clouded over, their smell strong enough to chase flies. He saw her approach and narrowed his eyes. She had nothing to offer. She knew that. But still she looked at the fish as if memorizing them, as if the sight alone might fill her. The man raised a brow, then gestured at a pile of broken sandals beside her feet. "Trade?" She shook her head slowly. He grunted, then picked up a fish and bit into it with yellowed teeth, chewing loudly. Livia turned and walked away before envy took her dignity. In the distance, near the shadow of the temple steps, a fire crackled. Not a hearth or a brazier, but a cooking pit made of rubble. Someone had lit it with charred scrolls, and now several figures stood around it with bowls, waiting. She drew closer and heard one of them speaking. Boiled roots, some cabbage, a pinch of flour. His voice was proud, though the soup looked more like cloudy water. The woman next to him passed a strip of linen as payment, then drank straight from the bowl. Her eyes closed as the steam hit her face. Livia hesitated, then stepped back. She had none of that. No fabric, no food, no words, only breath and skin and the memory of what she once was. She sat down near the edge of the broken steps and pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin upon them. The market moved around her, low voices, slow steps, occasional coughs. It was like watching a dream of life, foggy and half-formed. She closed her eyes. She remembered the Domus, Cassia's cough, Daphnis's laughter, the olive pit in the earth. She wondered if the others had left yet, if the master's family had begun their journey. She thought of the little girl staring at pigeons, of the woman who'd shared the barley bread without asking her name. She thought of all the names never spoken, all the stories never written. Rome was filled with them. Ghosts who walked not as spirits, but as people still breathing, still walking, still waiting for the next piece of ash bread or the next pot of boiled water. When she opened her eyes, night was beginning to settle. The market of echoes, as she now thought of it, began to fade. People moved off into corners, behind pillars, into ruined doorways. Fires dimmed. The sounds of the city retreated like waves. She stood up and wrapped her arms around herself. She was alone now, and still she was here. That night, the stars over Rome were pale and far away, not gone, just hidden, blurred behind drifting smoke, dust, and the soft breath of forgotten fires. Livia walked the edge of the forum in the dimness, her feet tracing lines between broken tiles. She did not return to the cart. She did not seek shelter. She simply walked as if movement itself might feed her, might distract her stomach from the gnawing ache that never left. The city, though wounded, still exhaled in long, low sighs through alleyways and under eaves. A heartbeat of torchlight pulsed from down near the edge of the Aventine, and something in Livia drew her toward it. She passed a collapsed wall, half covered in ivy. A child watched her from behind it, eyes bright in the dark. Neither spoke. Livia nodded once, and the child blinked, slowly, before retreating into shadow. Ahead, a narrow lane opened into what had once been a communal garden, now dry and littered with broken jars and the bones of long-forgotten meals. But in the center of the stone clearing, a fire burned low and steady, circled by a dozen souls, old, young, bent, and silent. No one shouted, no one laughed. They simply sat and watched the flames. Livia approached cautiously, stepping with care. One man turned his head slightly to acknowledge her, then scooted to the side, making space. She took it, settling onto a piece of cloth stretched over a stone. The heat of the fire crept slowly into her legs, through her skin, and into the emptiness beyond her ribs. She closed her eyes and let it do its work. No one asked who she was. No one asked what she had. That was the unspoken rule in the fire circle. You came with silence, you stayed with breath, and you left with whatever strength you had gained. The man beside her, wrinkled and lean, reached into his satchel and pulled out a sliver of roasted beet. He held it toward her without looking. She took it without speaking. The warmth spread across her tongue like honey, though it tasted of dirt and ash. Still she chewed it slowly, savoring every moment, every fiber. Across the fire, a woman began to sing, not loudly, barely more than a hum, a lullaby perhaps. Her voice cracked on some notes, but no one corrected her. It was not a performance, but a ritual. Others joined her softly, letting the melody ripple like wind through empty branches. Livia did not know the words, but she followed the rhythm with her breath, her eyes closing again. She drifted, then, half asleep, half aware, rocked by the rhythm of the fire, the distant song, and the steady rustle of shifting limbs. At some point, someone offered her water from a chipped cup. She drank it slowly, letting the coolness coat her throat. It tasted faintly of smoke and something sweet. She did not ask where it came from. When the fire burned low and the stars grew clearer in the thinning sky, people began to lie down where they sat, wrapping themselves in rags and cloth, curling near the warmth like cats. Livia remained upright, blinking at the dying flames. She thought of Cassia, whether the girl still breathed. She pictured Daphnis muttering his stories to no one, brushing dust from a bowl they no longer used. She imagined the olive tree, the soil above the buried pit, the mark she had left. The part of herself still rooted in the Domus. She felt no fear, not here, not in the company of those who, like her, had become invisible. There was a strange comfort in anonymity, in being part of the fire circle, unnamed and yet known. She would rise in the morning and move again. To where, she did not know. But for now, there was this place, this night, this moment of stillness carved from the stone bones of a starving city. And in that quiet, with the last spark of flame reflecting in her eyes, Livia finally slept. Livia woke just before dawn, her back sore from the uneven stone and her lips crusted with the salt of dried breath. Around her, the fire circle had become a scatter of sleeping forms, their shapes curled inward like leaves pulled close to their stems. A thin plume of smoke curled into the lightning sky above them, coiling lazily as though reluctant to leave. She sat up slowly, stretching her limbs, her joints stiff and cracking like dry reeds. Her stomach was quieter now, not from peace, but from submission. An old drum whose rhythm had faded into the soil. The woman who had sung the night before was gone. So were two of the men. Livia saw only footprints in the dust where they'd slept. That was the way of it. No goodbyes, no questions. You left when you could, you stayed when you must. The city no longer demanded anything else. As the first rays of sun broke over the edge of the rooftops, turning soot-stained walls into faint gold, Livia stood and walked toward the edge of the courtyard. The old communal garden stretched beyond her like a fossil, rows of dry beds, broken pottery, and vines that had long since stopped blooming. She stepped among them, brushing her fingertips along the brittle stems, her mind drifting back to a garden once tended by her mother. Grapes, onions, sprigs of mint trailing over stone. That garden had been full of hands, laughter, the splash of ladles into copper pots. She had been a child then, not yet sold, not yet named by another's lips. The thought of that time came with a strange sensation, like finding a familiar object that no longer fit the shape of her hand. She crouched and brushed aside the dirt from one of the garden furrows. A beetle crawled across her knuckle. She let it pass, its tiny legs pricking her skin like questions. Life went on, it seemed, even now. Behind her, the fire hissed as someone added a piece of old parchment to its belly. She turned, watching a boy no older than 10 lean forward, his fingers black with soot. He looked up and caught her gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, only a watchful stillness. She nodded. He nodded back. She should have stayed, perhaps. Let the city finish its slow collapse around her, piece by piece, like petals falling from a dry wreath. But something pulled at her, a thread, taut and quiet, a voice she could not name, calling from a place she had left behind. Not the Domus, not the master, or his marble halls, but the girl whose breath had grown thinner each day, Cassia and Daphnis, who had given her laughter like bread. The Domus would be hollow now, perhaps abandoned, but not forgotten. It was where her footsteps still echoed, where the olive pit lay beneath its thin blanket of soil. She had left part of herself there, and not out of duty, but care, memory, bond. She turned away from the garden. Without a word, she stepped back onto the street. The way was longer this time, each turn of the city feeling stranger, heavier. Smoke had marked the stones, and walls bore the streaks of soot and candle wax. Someone had drawn symbols with chalk on doorways, an eye, a hand, a line crossed through it. Warnings or maybe blessings. Livia did not stop to read them. When she reached the hill, her legs trembled. The climb was steep, the air hot even in the early morning. She paused at a fountain that no longer flowed, dipped her fingers into the stagnant water, pooled at its base, and touched them to her lips. The Domus stood ahead, quiet, its archways dark and still. No voices, no shouts, no guards. She entered slowly, barefoot. Inside, silence reigned. The atrium was cold and shadowed, as though it had sunk into itself. Leaves drifted across the floor. The hearth, long dead, bore no scent, no memory of flame. And yet everything was familiar, etched into her like the grooves in the stone tiles. She passed the garden where the olive tree still stood, its thin limbs stretched upward. A bird sat on one branch, quiet, unmoving. Beneath the tree, the earth was undisturbed. She knelt briefly, pressing her hand to the soil, feeling its warmth. Then she rose and turned toward the servants' quarters. The hallway that led to the servants' quarters felt longer than before. Its walls, once alive with the muffled shuffle of daily labor, now seemed swollen with silence. Livia walked slowly, her breath shallow, fingers trailing the wall for balance. The plaster had begun to flake. A spider's web stretched across a corner where a lantern used to hang. Each step echoed more than it should, the air thick with dust and disuse. She reached the doorway and paused. Inside, Daphne sat on the floor beside the mat where Cassia lay. His back was hunched, hands resting on his knees, gaze low and far away. His beard had grown fuller, whiter. His tunic hung loose around him. The only sound was the occasional flutter of cloth against the cracked window pane where wind snuck through. Livia stepped into the room without speaking. He did not startle. He only nodded once, a slow gesture that carried both welcome and apology. She knelt beside him and looked down at the girl. Cassia was still. Her body, slight and sunken, seemed almost translucent in the morning light. She lay on her side as if sleeping, arms folded gently at her chest. Someone had tucked the linen tightly around her, as though holding her together. A thin sprig of dried lavender rested atop her blanket. "She left yesterday," Daphnis said, voice sandpaper soft. "Just before the bell rang noon." Livia closed her eyes. She felt no sharp stab of grief, just the slow, heavy settling of a truth already known, already mourned in the quiet corners of her heart. "I was here," he continued. "I told her the story of the blue ox again. She liked that one, even when she couldn't laugh." They sat in silence. The room had changed little. The same shelves, the same blanket on the cot by the door, the same cracked bowl Cassia once tried to scrub until her fingers bled. Livia saw her own reflection in the window, older, thinner, eyes ringed in the fatigue of months. She reached out and smoothed a stray lock of hair from Cassia's brow. "She looks like she's waiting," Livia whispered. Daphnis nodded. "She always did." Later they wrapped her carefully in cloth. Not richly, there was nothing fine left, but with care, with honor. They used what clean linen remained, folded her arms and laid her beneath the olive tree just beside the shallow patch where Livia had buried the pit. The ground was dry, but soft enough for their hands. They worked slowly, not speaking, not crying. The labor was sacred. When they were done, Livia took one of the tree's lower branches and tied a strip of Cassia's old sash to it. The cloth caught the wind and danced slightly, a small flame of memory above the soil. They sat for a long while afterward, leaning against the roots. The Domus groaned softly in the wind. "She told me she dreamed of swimming," Daphnis said, breaking the quiet. "Said she could feel the water around her toes." "She couldn't swim," Livia murmured. "No," he smiled. "But she said the fish taught her, in her dreams." They both chuckled faintly, the sound brittle but true. As the afternoon light spilled across the courtyard, warming the tiled walls, Livia turned to Daphnis. "Do you want to leave?" He shook his head. "I have nowhere to go. I think I'll stay with the tree, watch what grows." She nodded slowly. "And if nothing grows?" "Then I'll keep watering it," he said, "until it remembers how." She didn't argue. There was no point. That evening, Livia returned to the upper part of the house. The master's chamber was empty, his scrolls gone. The children's sandals still sat by the door, dust-covered, outgrown. In the kitchen, she found an onion, small, sprouted, forgotten in the darkness. She held it like treasure, turning it in her palm, letting its papery skin catch the light. She did not cook it. She planted it beside the olive pit. And when the sun dipped behind the dome of a temple far across the city, Livia sat beside the soil and began to hum. It arrived not with thunder or warning, but gently, soft pattering against the broken tiles of the courtyard, the whisper of droplets tapping on clay and leaves. Livia woke to the scent of wet dust and opened her eyes to a sky the color of lead. She rose slowly, the stiffness in her joints giving way under the welcome cool of the air. She stepped barefoot onto the damp stones, tilted her face upward, and let the rain kiss her cheeks. It soaked her tunic in minutes. Thin as the cloth was, she felt no chill, only relief. It was the kind of rain Rome forgot it could make, clean, persistent, real. She walked into the center of the courtyard, arms outstretched, and let it bathe her. Behind her, the olive tree drank without complaint, its limbs trembling slightly under the weight of water. The earth beneath her toes softened, giving way as she stepped toward the buried pit. The cloth Cassia once wore still hung from the branch, now darker and heavier with rain. It swayed above the grave like a signal flag. Livia crouched beside the onion she'd planted. The soil was cracked but eager. Water traced rivulets through the dirt, pulling small bits of life downward. She reached for the empty amphora they used for storing rainwater and tilted it beneath a drip from the tiled eave. It filled quickly, water gurgling inside like laughter. She set it by the olive tree's base and fetched another. By the time Daphnis emerged from the lower rooms, she had gathered 6 jugs and lined them beside the tree, forming a quiet altar of survival. He grinned beneath his beard. "You look like a priestess," he said. "I might become one," she replied. "Of what temple?" "The Temple of Persistence." He nodded as though the name was familiar. In truth, it had existed long before either of them knew its face. They spent the day in slow labor, repairing leaks in the roof with cloth and paste, rearranging the kitchen to maximize whatever scraps remained. Daphnis fashioned a makeshift grate over the hearth with salvaged bronze, while Livia sorted old jars, shaking out dried bay leaves and fennel seeds, sniffing each to test their will. They found 2 figs in a box meant for storing ink pots, dry, shriveled, but edible. They shared one and saved the other. The Domus became a strange sort of home again, not grand, not ordered, but claimed. The silence, once thick and oppressive, had grown familiar. It embraced them now, let them speak only when needed, and filled in the spaces with birdsong and wind through broken shutters. In the evening, Livia took a bowl of water and placed it at the foot of Cassia's grave. She sat cross-legged beside it and whispered her day's events, about the rain, the figs, the way Daphnis had nearly dropped a jug on his foot. The earth did not answer, but she felt it listening. And when the wind rose, carrying the scent of wet stone and bruised leaves, she thought she heard a breath of laughter beneath it. The kitchen, once a place of command and clatter, had become their chapel. In the weeks since the rains, Livia had rearranged the room into something almost sacred. Not because it was clean, it wasn't. The soot stains on the walls had turned permanent, and the broken tiles still clicked underfoot, but because it held silence, the way a bowl holds broth. Every morning she entered first, sweeping dust from the hearth with a dried laurel branch, a motion that had become more blessing than chore. Daphnis followed with his cracked bowl and ladle, setting them gently on the bench like offerings. They spoke little while they worked. Their rhythm was learned through need. She would steep the herbs, he would stir the pot. She measured the lentils, he counted the drops of oil remaining in the bottom of a jar. Together they became something older than servants, caretakers of a fading world, menders of small sacred things. The hearth could not hold a fire large enough to warm the room, but they had learned how to coax flame from the thinnest splinters. Bits of grapevine, cloth dipped in wax, a twist of papyrus. They burned only what they must. Each day they made a thin porridge of millet and ground lentil, flavoured with vinegar, or the brittle peel of lemon they'd found in a basket long forgotten in the back storeroom. Once, Livia sprinkled it with dried lavender and called it a royal meal. Daphnis bowed in reply. In truth, they were eating little. But hunger had changed shape. It no longer came as pain, but as memory. They fed themselves in ways beyond food, stories, smells, rituals. Livia began placing stones on the windowsill to warm in the sunlight, then resting them at her feet in the evening. Daphnis crafted a wind chime from broken spoons, and each time it stirred, they pretended it meant good news had arrived. The Domus had settled into its bones. The wind no longer moaned through every crack. Instead, it moved like a companion, cool in the morning, dry in the afternoon, full of weight and patience. The olive tree stood stronger, its leaves greener now, its trunk somehow less weary. The onion had sprouted. It was a small, pale shoot, barely a finger's height, trembling in the breeze like a question. But it lived. Each morning, Livia knelt beside it, brushing aside the weeds, whispering to the soil. Not because she believed in miracles, but because she believed in remembering. The shoot became a part of her language, a word she spoke with her eyes, her hands, her hope. Some evenings they heard distant voices. Rome had not fallen, not fully. Somewhere the markets reopened or were replaced by new ones. Fires burned not from siege, but from meals. At night, songs drifted faintly across rooftops, and Livia would pause by the cracked window and close her eyes. The melodies had changed. They carried sorrow in their bellies, but also something else, resilience. Rome had not died. It had changed costume. Once, while gathering herbs from a vine near the outer wall, she saw a boy watching from the alley. He had no shoes, but his eyes were sharp. She offered him a sliver of fig, and he vanished before taking it. But the next day, a coin appeared on the step. It was foreign. Worthless, maybe, but smooth and warm from a child's hand. She tucked it into her sash. On quiet nights, she lit a single lamp and sat in the old dining room. The marble still gleamed in patches where light touched it. The painted ceiling had faded into ghost colors, ochre, smoke, and age, but it still told its stories if one stared long enough. Gods chasing mortals, vines twisting into urns, a lion resting beside a sleeping lamb. The stories were wrong, of course, but beautiful. She imagined the mistress once sitting there, her fingers dipped in rose oil, her voice sharp, the children whispering jokes under their breath, the slaves passing silently, unnoticed. She imagined it and then released it. The house had passed through fire and famine and now stood softer, quieter, not empty, but returned. That night, as the rain returned in whispers, Livia placed a dry laurel leaf atop the hearth and lit it with care. "Bless this hunger," she whispered, and she meant it. In the third month of quiet, Livia awoke to the smell of flour. It was faint, nearly imperceptible, but unmistakable. Not fresh bread, not the sweetness of a warm oven, but flour itself, dry, chalky, with the ghost of wheat behind it. She sat up slowly, her heart thudding not with hope, but disbelief. Scent had tricked her before. Once she had smelled garum in the wind and chased it all the way to the temple ruins, only to find a burned satchel and the remains of fish bones long buried. But this was different. This was inside the house. She rose without speaking and followed the smell like a string through fog. Down the stone corridor, past the cracked jug filled with bay leaves, into the rear storage room once locked to her hands. The door hung ajar now, its bronze hinges green with age. Inside, the shelves were mostly bare, the air stale and unmoved, but on the table lay a sack. Open, new, flour, coarse, pale, handful, no more. Beside it, a wooden scoop and a scrap of parchment with a wax mark she didn't recognize. She stood still for a long time, the dust in the air catching the light like falling snow. "Someone's come?" Daphnis said behind her. She turned. He looked past her, not at the flower, but at the doorway, as if expecting someone to appear and claim it. "Why leave it?" she whispered. He shrugged. Perhaps they meant it as thanks, or tribute, or they couldn't carry more. "Then they'll return?" He nodded. "Likely." Livia approached the flower slowly. She didn't touch it yet. Instead, she dipped her fingers into the air just above it, letting the scent coat her fingertips. Her stomach stirred, not with hunger, but memory, the feel of kneading dough, of clapping her palms free of powder, of watching steam rise from a fresh loaf torn between two hands. She looked at Daphnis and saw the same memory flicker behind his eyes. They did not bake that day. They were too careful, too reverent. Instead, they split the flour into 2 equal portions. One was sealed in a jar, labeled with a strip of olive bark. The other was mixed with water and stretched over cloth, left to catch wild yeast near the garden wall. A starter, a beginning, a wager with time. The house had begun speaking again, not in voices but in movement. Livia noticed the footprints near the rear gate, not hers, bare and narrow, too small to be Daphnis's, the boy perhaps, or others like him. Once scavengers, now wanderers. Someone had tidied the outer steps. A new string hung beside the water jug, woven with dried rosemary and string. A sign of what she didn't know, but it meant something. Even in silence, the city was sending messages. She began leaving bowls near the wall. Clean water, a crushed sprig of mint, a few lentils if there were extra. Sometimes the bowls were emptied, sometimes they were left untouched. Once a feather was placed inside. Another time a small twist of waxed cloth containing a sliver of honeycomb. Someone was listening. The house no longer belonged to anyone, yet it welcomed all. A resting place, a breath between storms. And so Livia returned to her rhythm. In the mornings, she whispered to the onion, now tall enough to cast a shadow. She cleaned the olive leaves of dust with her fingers. She watered the earth not because it demanded it, but because it deserved it. In the evenings, she and Daphnis sat in the atrium, recounting fragments of old stories. Not whole epics, just moments. The way Cassia once called the stars crumbs of bread, how the mistress used to comb her daughter's hair so gently on feast days, how the master, once proud, spent his last days staring at an empty scroll. They spoke without bitterness, without longing, only record, memory given shape by words and laid like stones along a garden path. On the 7th day, the sourdough starter breathed. It bubbled gently in its cloth wrap, sour and warm. Livia held it like a bird's egg, smiling at the soft pulse of life. They did not bake bread that night, but they lit a lamp, and it burned steadily until morning. The sound came faintly at first, like distant rain or the soft knocking of a child at a heavy door. Livia heard it while rinsing linen in the courtyard basin. She paused, her fingers dripping with cold water, and tilted her head. Not birdsong, not fire, not voices. Hammers, rhythmic, persistent, like breath drawn through wood. She walked to the edge of the garden and placed her hand against the stone wall. The sound was coming from the east, past the slope of rooftops beyond the ruined avenue. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't angry. It was, building. She called for Daphnis, who was sorting clay tiles by the storage chamber, and together they stood beside the wall, listening. A breeze carried more than the hammering. Voices now, low, muttered, working voices. It had been so long since Livia had heard conversation that wasn't hushed or heavy. These were the voices of effort, of coordination, men moving beams, women shouting for mortar. Somewhere, someone rebuilding, not in fear, not in panic, but because they had decided the world must begin again. Daphnis said nothing. His hands rested on the stone like a priest at an altar. Livia could feel his pulse in the air beside her, steady and real. He didn't ask what they were building. They both knew it didn't matter. It could be a stall, a shelter, a roadblock, or an altar. The point was not the shape. The point was the motion. Rome, bruised, starved, stripped of its former glory, was trying to remember what it meant to be alive. Later that afternoon, Livia ventured beyond the Domus walls. She took the long way, past the water-stained mural of the three dancers, their colours faded to rust and bone. She passed the boy's feather from weeks ago, still pinned to the shutter with a chip of pottery. When she reached the upper terrace, she paused. From there, the city lay like a half-spoken prayer. Rooftops broken but occupied, windows open to the sun, smoke rising in clean spirals from small fires that cooked instead of warmed. A woman carried a basket of herbs in one hand and a babe in the other. A man lifted stones from a collapsed oven and piled them into new walls. Children ran barefoot between puddles, chasing one another with sticks and rags like royalty with scepters. The city had not been healed, but it had begun to breathe in rhythm again. When she returned to the Domus, her arms were filled with rosemary and green onions, bartered from a woman who said simply, "Take what you need. We've started sharing again." Livia placed the herbs on the hearth and looked at Daphnis. "It's coming back?" she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Rome?" "No," she said. "The idea of it." They baked the bread that evening. The starter had grown thick and sour, alive with tiny bubbles. Livia kneaded the dough with careful, reverent hands, sprinkling in the chopped rosemary like a priestess, anointing an offering. The loaf was small, baked over coals with a cracked lid as a dome. It took hours. The scent drifted through the Domus like incense, curling around stone pillars and brushing the cracked ceiling. It woke every corner of the house that had slept through months of hunger. When it was done, they broke it together at the base of the olive tree. Daphnis tore the loaf with his hands, steam rising in soft curls. Livia took a bite first. It was dense, a little bitter, crusted too hard, but it was bread. Honest, made by their hands, shaped by breath and waiting. She gave a piece to the soil over Cassia's grave, then rested back against the tree's roots. In the dusk, with the birds returning to the sky and the olive leaves rustling overhead, the world did not feel full, but it felt sufficient. Enough. A bowl not brimming but not empty either. And as the hammers continued to echo faintly through the city, Livia whispered thanks not to gods but to the unseen hands who had left flour at her door. The morning air was mild, and for the first time in months, the city breathed without wheeze or wince. The rain had cleaned the streets, and the smoke no longer hung like a second ceiling over Rome. The Domus awoke in quiet ripples, creaking shutters, the flap of cloth catching the wind, Daphnis humming a low, tuneless melody as he swept the garden tiles. Livia sat beneath the olive tree, her hands tucked into her lap, watching a snail trace a slow arc across a broken roof tile. The sun slid gently down the walls, illuminating tiny spider threads spun overnight between the fig pots. She had begun keeping a garden again. Nothing extravagant, just scraps of life planted in soft, respectful silence. The onion now wore 2 shoots, proud and reaching. She'd added sprigs of purslane along the southern wall, where the light lingered longest, and tucked 6 garlic cloves into loose soil beside the hearth. In the mornings, she sang to them. Not words, exactly, just hums and syllables, old lullabies with their language worn away. The kind her mother once sang while boiling grain in clay pots, her elbows resting on the table, eyes soft with thought. The garden was not just hers anymore. It belonged to the house, to Cassia, who lay beneath the earth, to Daphnis, who now kept a bundle of mint tucked behind one ear like a badge of honor, to the boy who came at twilight and left small treasures, dried orange peel, a smooth white stone, a twig carved into the shape of a fish. One morning, the boy did not leave his gift on the step. He waited instead. Livia saw him through the back gate, half shadowed by the wall, thin, dark-eyed, his tunic stained with soot and dye. He didn't speak, just held out his hand. In it lay a handful of sunflower seeds, their shells pale and dry. "For you," he said, voice hoarse from disuse. Livia stepped closer, crouched to his height. "Thank you," she said gently. "From my sister," he added. "She says plants need friends." Livia smiled. She's right. The boy left then without another word, but she felt his presence linger, a kind of soft echo in the Domus. That night, she planted the seeds in a circle beside the olive tree. She whispered a promise to them as she covered their shells with soil. "Grow not for fruit," she said, "grow for proof." It was nearly noon when the first walkers appeared on the street beyond the Domus. Not soldiers, not merchants, but people like her. Barefoot, sunburned, wrapped in shawls that flapped like wings. Some pushed carts with wooden wheels that creaked over cobblestone. Others led donkeys carrying sacks of wheat and pots of salt. One woman had a goat slung across her back, its legs bundled like a sleeping child. Livia and Daphnis watched from the upper balcony, leaning against the stone balustrade. They said nothing at first, simply listening to the murmur of footfalls, the clink of tools, the occasional burst of conversation. Rome was moving again, not in haste or alarm, but in determination. The siege had ended months ago, but now its shadow was finally lifting. "They're heading south," Daphnis said quietly. "Tiber?" Livia guessed. "Or the sea. Maybe they're following grain shipments." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the end of the avenue where the line of walkers faded into sun glare. A girl with a basket balanced on her head caught Livia's eye. She wore a red ribbon around her wrist. It fluttered as she walked. Behind her, a pair of boys dragged a makeshift sledge filled with tin cups and string. Not scavengers, not beggars, just children playing, even now, even here. Livia felt her breath catch in her throat. The city had not forgotten how to be young. That evening, they broke another loaf, their third since the starter began, and smeared it with mashed garlic and herbs. The flavor startled her at first. It was bright, almost arrogant. She laughed aloud. Daphnis blinked, then joined her. The bread was not perfect, dense again, slightly too bitter. But it was loud, unapologetic, alive. They saved a crust and placed it at the foot of Cassia's tree. Livia tucked it beneath a stone so the birds wouldn't take it. "You would have liked this one," she whispered. "It bites back." The tree's leaves rustled softly in reply. Days folded into one another with the rhythm of a lullaby. The walkers came and went, the sun rose and fell. One afternoon, a woman knocked at the front gate, a bold sound, deliberate, unhurried. Livia answered and found her standing tall, robes modest, hair tied in neat coils. Her face bore the sun's mark, lined, tanned, steady. "I heard this house had roots," she said. Livia tilted her head. "It has a garden," she replied. The woman smiled. "That's enough." She stayed 3 days. Her name was Marcia. She had travelled from the north, following caravans and bartering stories for shelter. She shared tales of other cities, some still closed, others teeming with trade again. She showed Livia how to dry herbs with ash, how to mend tunics with waxed thread, how to identify spoiled oil by its colour. In return, Livia gave her garlic, a sliver of bread, and a corner of the courtyard where she could rest. On the 4th morning, Marcia left without fanfare. But in her wake, she left behind a small wrapped pouch, flax seeds dried and silver grey, a piece of folded parchment tucked within it. On it, in clear, careful script, "For when you're ready to start again." Livia placed it in a jar beside the hearth. Not yet, but soon. The city changed slowly, not with spectacle, but with steadiness. Livia began to hear carts again, wooden wheels rattling over stone, the creak of oxen yokes, the rise and fall of bartering voices. Markets reopened, coins returned, children ran errands, dogs barked, not in fear, but in boredom. One afternoon, while fetching water from the cistern at the corner, Livia passed a man with a lute. He strummed it lazily, a tune half-formed and playful. She paused beside him and listened for a moment. He looked up and nodded, then returned to his song. The music followed her all the way back to the Domus. Later, as she swept the courtyard, she caught herself humming it. One night, the wind brought the scent of citrus. Real citrus, sweet, sharp, clean. She stood at the threshold of the sleeping quarters and inhaled deeply, eyes closed. When she opened them, the moon cast silver across the floor, and she thought she saw something, just for a moment, beside the olive tree. Cassia, barefoot, laughing, then gone. Livia did not cry. She sat beneath the tree and spoke to the soil. "We didn't starve," she said softly. "Not really." She ran her fingers through the earth, crumbling it between her fingers. "We learned how to be full with less." Daphnis joined her with 2 cups of broth, and they drank without toasting, without speech. Just the sound of the wind through branches and the whisper of seeds shifting underground. It began with a message scratched into the dust. Livia found it early one morning, before Daphnis had woken, and before the sun had touched the eastern walls. She'd gone to sweep the steps outside the Domus gate and found the words traced in long, deliberate strokes along the base of the marble threshold. "House of Roots." Bread was kind, thank you. Beneath it, the simple mark of a spiral, looped twice, then broken at the edge. A symbol not of ownership, nor of faith, but of movement, of continuation. Livia stood above it for a long moment, the broom hanging loosely in her fingers, the chill of dawn brushing her ankles. The words were small, but they rang louder than any horn. Someone had seen them. Someone had eaten what they'd shared, drunk from their clay bowl, and returned not for more, but to offer something back. She let the message sit there all day, not sweeping it, not brushing it aside. Visitors passed now and then, quiet figures, travellers, boys carrying woven baskets, mothers with jugs balanced on hips. Some stopped and read the message, some nodded. A few touched the stone beside it, as if feeling for warmth. The Domus had become known, not formally, not by name, but by rhythm. The olive tree, the small garden, the bowl of water at the threshold. Daphnis called it the mouthless temple. Livia preferred House of Return, but they never painted a sign, never carved letters into wood. The name was in the way the wind moved through it, in the way bread was broken and left behind. In the evenings now, Livia kept a small tablet by the hearth. On it, she etched short phrases in wax, reminders, offerings, prayers in disguise. One day she wrote, "Dig deep, even dust remembers water." Another, "There is bread, and there is enough." Daphne sometimes added sketches, a fish with outstretched fins, a bowl with waves inside, a girl holding a bird by the feet. They never discussed who might read them. The city was a net now, its threads newly spun, some fraying, some tight. Livia could feel it whenever she walked the lanes. The marketplace pulsed again, not with the same luxury as before, but with barter, with trust. Cloth for herbs, salt for oil, a story for a song. People remembered how to trade without ledgers. They remembered how to meet each other's eyes. At a stall near the old temple of Janus, she saw something that stopped her. A row of loaves, real bread, plump and brown, with slashes carved across the tops. Next to them sat a boy, no older than 8, with sun-cracked lips and a face she recognized, the same boy who'd once left her sunflower seeds. He grinned when he saw her and held out a piece. "First one's for you," he said. She took it in both hands, mouth open, heart full. "Did you bake these?" "My sister. I grind the grain." "You're doing well," she said softly. He shrugged, shy but proud. "We have a corner near the basilica. People stop. We don't ask why." She pressed a fig into his hand. It was one of 2 she'd carried all morning. The other she would leave beneath Cassia's tree. She turned to go, but he called out, "You still have the garden?" "I do." His voice dropped. "Some of us might need it. When the roads grow quiet again, there will always be a place." At the Domus, she found Daphnis sitting beneath the olive tree, sketching on a shard of tile with a piece of charcoal. He was humming again, his voice low and warm, like fire crackling behind stone. She sat beside him and broke the bread in half. They ate slowly, chewing without urgency, as the sun filtered through green leaves above them. Later that week, the first letter came. It arrived wrapped in waxed cloth, tucked inside a reed basket left by the water bowl. Livia found it at dusk, just as the sky turned the color of old plum. She unfolded the cloth gently, her fingers brushing the wax, and pulled out a folded slip of parchment. The ink was faded but neat. To the ones who stayed, it began. "My son tells me you give without asking, that you fed him when I could not, that your walls do not demand names or stories, only need. We have little, but we are growing again. I send you these fig seeds and a prayer I remember from my mother's tongue. May the hands that give never grow cold. May the mouth that offers always be fed." It was signed with a symbol, a hand drawn beside a tree. Livia read it twice, then again. Then she passed it to Daphnis, who read it aloud with care, pausing after each line. They didn't speak after, they didn't need to. They planted the fig seeds the next morning, just beside the old root wall. Livia pressed each one into the earth with her thumb, sealing it with a drop of water. As she worked, a girl passed the gate and smiled through the bars. She didn't stop, just smiled and kept walking. That night, a storm passed through the city. Not violent, but sure. The kind of rain that enters stone. Livia stood in the atrium, arms folded, watching the water run down the columns and puddle across the tiles. The Domus held steady, roof patched, walls thick, garden covered. She lit a lamp and moved through each room, checking windows, whispering to walls. The storage room where they'd found the flour now held grain. 3 sacks, modest but precious. The kitchen smelled of thyme. The sleeping quarters, clean and dry. And Cassia's grave was soft with rain. Livia sat beside it with her blanket wrapped tight, and whispered stories into the soil, ones Cassia had never heard, tales of fish that swallowed moons, of girls who grew wings from garlic skins, of cities that vanished and reappeared as gardens. Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. Daphnis joined her just before midnight, bringing warm broth in clay bowls. They shared it beneath the olive tree, steam curling upward like incense, disappearing into the night. "We'll leave again one day," he said. "Others will need the space." Livia nodded. "But not yet." "No," he agreed. "Not yet." Above them, the olive leaves shimmered in the wind. And the Domus, once broken, once starved, breathed again. The first true winter after the siege arrived like a long exhale, soft and tired, not sharp or cruel. The wind was cold, yes, but not spiteful. The skies turned pale and patient, draping the city in a blue-grey hush that muffled footfalls and gave the streets a kind of reverence. Fires burned in controlled hearths, not in panicked torches. Rome no longer cried for warmth, it gathered it. And in quiet corners people began to speak in longer sentences, stringing thoughts together like pearls once lost. Livia wrapped herself in a thick wool cloak someone had left by the olive tree weeks earlier. No note, no face, just the gift itself, draped carefully over the garden wall. It smelled faintly of rosemary and ash, and when she wore it, the fabric held her like arms. She had not been touched in months. Not really. This was close. Daphnis was slower now, his knees stiffened with the cold, and he often stayed near the hearth, carving bits of soft wood into animals, goats, dogs, once a peacock with a tail like waves. He lined them along the rim of the fountain, beneath the dry spout. "A parade," he called them, "for no one and everyone." Children sometimes took them, returning days later with thanks etched into bark or drawn in chalk on stones. They still baked bread. The starter had grown temperamental in the cooler air, but Livia kept it fed, wrapping it in cloth and humming to it like an infant. Their loaves were denser now but fragrant, full of garlic and crushed fennel. She dried the slices near the fire and ground the hardened crumbs into soup. Nothing wasted, not ever again. She had not forgotten hunger. It lived in her like a scar beneath her ribs, not visible, but always there, a knowing. But she no longer feared it. It had lost its edge, its cruelty. It had become something familiar, like an old friend who had once betrayed you, now quiet, asking only for distance. The Domus held more people now, never many, never long, but it had become a waypoint, a shelter, a place known in soft-spoken warnings and quiet gratitude. The house with the tree? The one with bread by the door? They won't ask your name. Travellers came in ones and twos, women fleeing broken homes, men with songs and empty bellies, children who spoke only with their eyes. Livia gave what she could: warm water, a place to sit. Stories passed gently from tongue to ear. Daphnis showed them how to coax fire from cold stone, how to find edible moss in the cracks near the cistern, how to listen to the wind and tell if rain would last. They never turned anyone away. One night, a woman arrived with frostbitten fingers and a baby wrapped in linen. Livia took them in without a word. She warmed the mother's hands in bowls of oil and wrapped the child in a tunic lined with dry fig leaves. She did not ask where the father was. She did not need to. The woman stayed 2 nights, then left with a kiss to Livia's palm. She whispered a single word before leaving: "Anchor." Livia didn't ask what it meant. She just nodded. The fig seeds had taken root. Not all, but enough. 2 small saplings now rose near the rear wall, their trunks thin, their leaves sparse but green. Livia tended them each morning with fingers calloused from care. She sang them the same lines each day. Grow slow, grow steady, grow sure. She did not expect fruit for years, perhaps never. But the act was enough. To place something into soil and watch it rise, that was the only miracle she trusted now. The olive tree, meanwhile, had begun to flower. Small white blossoms, delicate and determined, clung to the branches like breath held long and finally released. Daphnis saw them first and didn't speak for several moments. He simply stood beneath the tree, palms open as if blessing it or asking for its blessing. They said it wouldn't bloom again, he murmured. They were wrong, Livia replied. He turned to her. Cassia would have laughed. She would have said it was about time, Livia said, smiling. And in the silence that followed, they heard the city breathing again, not in fear, not in fire, but in rhythm. A woman singing across the street, a pot clanging against stone, a goat bleating in protest, laughter, not loud, not many, but laughter. A boy came that week with a request. He was older now, no longer the one who'd left seeds on the step. He carried himself differently, shoulders squared, eyes focused. He bowed once before speaking. Can we use the upper room? Just for a meeting. We'll leave it as we found it. Livia did not hesitate. Yes. He smiled, then added, You'll be welcome, if you wish. That evening, 5 people gathered in the old dining chamber. They did not wear uniforms, they carried no banners, but they spoke with care and listened with deeper care. They talked of food routes, of rebuilding the aqueduct, of training the young in trade and story. They passed around a slate where each person etched a dream, not a plan, not a law, just a dream. When it came to Livia, she wrote, No one hungry, no one silenced. They read it in silence, then nodded. The next morning, she found a satchel of barley left beside the garden gate. No name, no mark, just a gift. In the final days of winter, as the sun lingered longer across the courtyard and the frost melted from the windows before noon, Livia sat beneath the olive tree with Daphnis and watched the shadows stretch. A pigeon had nested in the upper beam near the kitchen. A vine had begun climbing the gate. The house no longer felt like a tomb or a fortress. It felt like breath held open. She turned to Daphnis and asked softly, Do you remember your first day here? He nodded. I was 15. I carried grapes on my head and dropped half. The mistress was furious. You laughed, he said. I wasn't supposed to. You weren't, he chuckled. But you did. She closed her eyes. It feels like 100 years ago. Maybe it was, he said, and neither of them argued. They sat in silence as the fig leaves trembled in the breeze and the olive blossoms fell, one by one, into the garden soil. The olive blossoms fell in clusters that morning, silent as snow. Livia sat beneath the tree, her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around them, chin resting atop the curve of her wrist. The air smelled of earth warmed by sunlight and crushed green from the fig saplings. The Domus was hushed, not because it was empty, but because it was full. In every crack, every tile, every whispering leaf, there was the soundless weight of something returned. Presence. She had not eaten since dawn, but she did not feel hunger. There was a fullness in her that had little to do with bread. It was in the warmth of the stones beneath her, the rhythm of Daphnis's footfalls in the kitchen, the stretch of shadow that passed over Cassia's grave as the sun climbed high. Fullness lived now in her memory, yes, but also in the softness of breath, in the way the garden leaned toward her voice, in the way people touched the gate with reverence before stepping through. She no longer measured days by meals nor nights, by how long her stomach turned. She measured them by the blooming, the growth, the return of rhythm to the broken. In the afternoon, the boy came again, older still. He carried no gifts this time. Instead, he brought news. "They say a road is opening east," he said, sitting beside her on the edge of the basin. "They'll need people who know plants, and people who remember how to wait." He looked at her with the same dark eyes she'd first seen peeking through the gate all those months ago. "You could go." She smiled gently and shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "There are still things that need to grow here." He nodded without disappointment, as if he'd known the answer already. "Then I'll bring you a stone from the new road," he said. "So you'll know it's real." Livia reached out and touched his hand, brief, warm, firm. "And I'll be here when you return?" As the boy left, the sun dipped lower, casting long streaks of gold across the courtyard. The air was soft with promise. Daphnis emerged with 2 cups of spiced broth, and they sat beneath the olive tree once more, sipping slowly, letting silence settle around them like a cloak. No words were needed. They had spoken enough. Everything worth saying now lived in the garden, in the rising of green where once there was dust, in the crack of bread shared without debt, in the way even strangers left messages in the soil. When the stars began to blink into the sky, slow, deliberate, familiar, Livia lay back on the stones and closed her eyes. She heard the fig leaves fluttering, the birds shifting in their nests, the soft creak of the wind moving through the gate. And beneath it all, the steady beat of the world, quiet, slow, enduring. She was not hungry. She was home.